Professor Ivor Griffith, co-founder and fellow, Caribbean Policy Consortium and esteemed chair of this afternoon's webinar. Excellencies, Mr. Bruce Zagaris, American Bar Association, Criminal Justice Section. Dr. Michael Powinski, IR faculty lead for this event, CPC Leadership and Fellows, esteemed panelists, Dr. Melissa Neptune Figaro of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, Mr. Calixtus Joseph, CARICOM Impacts, Mr. Ivan Capio, State Department Caribbean Security Initiative, Mr. Bruce Zakaris, partner at Bellina, Cochran and Rowe, and CPC fellow, Ms. Nalini Mahabir, IR student who will be delivering the vote of thanks, heads of international and regional organizations, other members of the diplomatic corps, members of the U.W.I St. Augustine community, colleagues, students, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the webinar, The Arms Trafficking Menace in the Caribbean, Understanding the Crime and Litigation Dynamics, jointly hosted by the Institute of International Relations, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, and the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. I want to start by expressing our deepest gratitude to our partners, the Caribbean Policy Consortium and the American Bar Association, for their collaboration in hosting this very timely and important discussion. This partnership has certainly raised the profile of the event in the national, regional, and international phase. Appreciation to Professor Griffith and Mrs. Zagaris for leading the charge on behalf of their respective organizations. I want to especially thank Professor Ivor Griffith for proposing this topic and Dr. Powinski for his leadership and organization of the event on the IR side. I also want to acknowledge and thank our very distinguished panelists whose participation has also enhanced the webinar's visibility and legitimacy. We want you to know how much it means to us that you have taken the time to share your expertise on the topic. In keeping with the Institute's mandate, we host a range of events intended to promote discussion and exchange of ideas and on issues of relevance to the international relations of the Caribbean and regional development. The diversity of issues on which we engage highlights, among many things, the multidisciplinary nature of our work and our ability to bridge the gap between theory, policy, and practice. Importantly, these exercises promote public presence, generate knowledge, and advance the policy relevance of our work. We sometimes execute events collaboratively with both individuals and organizations. For the latter, they include other private sector organizations, research and policy bodies, national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations, including civil society bodies. We have collaborated with the Caribbean Policy Consortium in hosting numerous policy dialogues on diverse issues of concern to the region, including, but not exclusive to the war in Ukraine, Haiti, Caribbean-Africa relations, governance and electoral continuity and change in the Caribbean, U.S.-Caribbean relations, among others. This is the second collaborative public dialogue with the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. Incidentally, the first was on the illicit trafficking of firearms in the Caribbean and Latin America, which we co-hosted with the CPC and ABA in July last year. We value these partnerships and we look forward to expanding and deepening these partnerships. Having said all of this, none of this would have been possible if the public did not show interest and attend the event. Our deepest appreciation to all of you who have made the time to be here. I would like to thank our supporters, old and new friends, colleagues, and students who are here today to participate in this very important discussion. I also wish to extend gratitude to your U.W.I marketing department for their technical and marketing support, our partners for marketing the event, Ms. Chanel Shady for providing administrative support, and our own IT team for their support. With this, I wish to thank everyone and wish you a productive and enjoyable discussion. I thank you. I now pass on to our moderator, Professor Griffith, to continue the proceedings this afternoon. Professor Griffith.
Thank you, Dr. Montut, and let me add my word of thanks and kudos to all the people who you've named. And I look forward to having the wonderful partnership about which we are engaged with passion today and into the future. About 4 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, several of us from the Caribbean and the United States decided to lend the passion we hold for the region to form an organization called the Caribbean Policy Consortium. What we do in the consortium is act as a think tank that not only discusses but pursues advocacy for Caribbean issues in the United States and in the region. We've been doing so over the years in partnership with several organizations, some of which were named by Dr. Mantoux. Those partner organizations include U.W.I St. Augustine, the Sri-At Ramphel Center. They include the Manchester Trade Organization, but it also is part of the partnership ambit that FIU is a significant part of what we do, and we're expanding the purview of our engagement over time. We're delighted in the CPC to have another episode of this partnership looking at a critical issue, and I'm delighted that thanks to the instrumentality of Bruce Sagaris, good friend and CPC partner and fellow, we're able to join with the American Bar Association again in delivering this webinar. Let me thank you all, encourage you to participate fully, and let me now turn the proceedings over to Bruce, who will say a few words and then hand it back over to me. Bruce?
Thank you, Ivelaw, and warm welcome from the American Bar Criminal Justice Section. This is the third of a series of webinars that we've had the honor of organizing with CPC, and also the second webinar in which we've participated with IIR. I co-chair the International Committee of the Criminal Justice Section, and obviously this issue is very important to the whole region. So I want to again congratulate all the people that have been named, and particularly Ivelaw, with whom I'm a fellow at the CPC. So with that, I turn it back to Ivelaw.
Thank you, Bruce. Last Friday, there was a significant letter sent by the Attorney General of New York State to the leaders of Congress. That letter went to Speaker Mike Johnson, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who was the minority leader. It went to Senator Charles Schumer, and it went to Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. I'd like to read you a couple of sentences from this letter, a letter that pertains to the subject that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. Here is what, among other things, the Attorney General of New York, along with other attorneys general, said in that letter to Congress. On behalf of the states of New York, California, Connecticut, Delaware, the District of Columbia, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and our state's chief law enforcement officers, we write to emphasize the importance of legislative measures to combat arms trafficking to our neighbors in the Caribbean. In recent years, the letter continues, the number of guns smuggled from the United States to Caribbean nations has surged. Officials in the Caribbean estimate that roughly 90% of guns used in murders were bought in the United States and smuggled to Caribbean nations. Reports indicate that the trafficking is mostly attributable to small-scale operators who often send guns via cargo shipping companies. These traffickers are aided, whether knowingly or unknowingly, by gun dealers in this country who sell to straw purchasers, that is, people who are purchasing guns for others. A few more sentences from this letter. The result of this steady flow of guns has been the increased gun violence in the region. For instance, the letter continues, a 2023 United Nations report indicated that the United States has been, quote, a principal source of firearms and munitions in Haiti, unquote. A conclusion consistent with reports from the United States Department of Homeland Security. The consequences at a time of deteriorating security conditions and heightened violence have been devastating. Increased trafficking of firearms and drugs has benefited gangs and their backers and have made it most difficult for international agencies to provide life-saving humanitarian aid. Other countries across the Caribbean have noticed a similar increase in guns illegally trafficked from the United States. I share, ladies and gentlemen, those few sentences from this important letter to suggest to you that we're talking about a phenomenon that is transnational in character, that is complex in character, but that also is multidimensional in character. And we have a wonderful set of experts to probe the issues, to probe the transnationality, the complexity, the multidimensionality, enabling us to have a conversation that will lead to some broadening the horizon, both of knowledge and potential action by people who are part of this forum. Let me tell you who these colleagues, panelists are. I'll introduce them all now, and then we'll begin their presentations. Each person has 15 to 18 minutes for initial remarks, after which we'll have questions and comments and a robust conversation. Let me introduce by the first person who will speak, Dr. Melissa Neptune Figaro. She's a criminologist and a lecturer at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine, who secured her PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Florida State University. In addition to her teaching, she is committed to researching in areas of criminology, migration and immigrant studies, violent extremism, and among other things, gang violence in the Caribbean. Dr. Neptune Figaro has published on immigrant and crime relationships, on firearm trafficking in the Caribbean and violent extremism, and she has the honor of serving as a member of the American Society of Criminology Police Research Group. Melissa will be followed by Mr. Calixtus Joseph. Mr. Joseph, Assistant Director for Policy, Strategy, and Innovation at CARICOM Impacts, is an expert resource facilitator for the German Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, something he has been doing since 2015. Calixtus is lead author of both the CARICOM Crime and Security Strategy and the CARICOM Counterterrorism Strategy. He has served on panels related to international and regional security, transnational organized crime, peace and security, tourism security, among other things. Calixtus will be followed by Dr. Ivan Carpio. Ivan is a coordinator for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and he's the lead for security issues in the United States Department of State's Office of Caribbean Affairs. He previously served in the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, and at various times he served working on critical issues regarding Haiti, the Eastern Caribbean, Guyana, and Honduras. Ivan also has the distinction of being able to have worked in the Congress, aiding and supporting Representative Joaquin Castro in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He holds a JD and an MA in International Affairs from American University, and he has his bachelor's from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Last but not least is my friend Bruce Agaris, member of the CPC as a founding fellow, an attorney in Washington, D.C. with the firm Berliner, Corcoran and Rowe, position he's been with since 2016. Since 2016, he's been an adjunct professor of international white-collar crime at Texas A&M. Bruce has published several books in international criminal law, and since 1985, he has edited a journal on international law enforcement. Bruce has also had the distinction of serving as a member of the faculty of the U.W.I. Law School, law faculty in Cave Hill. He's a member of the CPC, and he has numerous other engagements both within the United States and across the hemisphere. So allow me to encourage you to join me with a virtual round of applause for our panelists. I'll turn first to the first speaker, and after which we'll move right on to the next person. After all the speakers will have spoken, we'll have for a Q&A, and we look forward to having a wonderful conversation about this critical issue that is characterized by transnationality, complexity, and multidimensionality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Melissa Neptune Figaro. Melissa?
Thank you very much. I'm just sharing. Thank you. Are you hearing me? I'm just sharing my PowerPoint. Yes. So good afternoon, everybody, all our guests, the other panelists, and thank you for having me here. I have observed everyone who is in the room. It's all protocols observed. So my topic today would be on unveiling the threat of the illicit firearm in the Caribbean. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was a research that I have done, and it actually stems from a larger research that was done with small arms trafficking. I think Mr. Joseph will be very familiar with it because it comes out of CARICOM impacts. And so looking at that set of data that was done by the Small Arms Survey, we actually did partner with another colleague at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Randy C. Prasad, and myself with Dr. Michael Powinski. And what we did was actually took the data and manipulated a little bit to get a little bit more information and merged that with some of the statistics that we had with our TTPS as well as intelligence units regarding firearms within the Caribbean, specifically Trinidad and Tobago. So one of the things that we looked at was just violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Caribbean region is known to have one of the highest violent death rates in the Caribbean. And most of these homicides are actually committed with firearms. And when we looked at the empirical research, it kind of looked at the entire region, and the CARICOM states itself, if you look at it, they kind of tripled in global average of these types of killings. And so we have data here from 2017 to 2021, and we see that Trinidad is on top with the top Caribbean states that actually have high murder rates per capita. So Jamaica being the highest, then St. Kitts and Nevis, and then Trinidad and Tobago at 31.4% per capita. But we also compared it to United States, the entire country rather than by state, and United States have an average of 5.4 murders per capita, right? So we are excessively high with regards to the murder rates and crimes committed, and the majority of the murders are committed by firearms. And this research kind of sought to assess the use of these firearms, what people generally think when they have a firearm, and just understanding the idea of trafficking of these firearms within our locale. And so when we move for just looking at the statistics here of the murders, I want to show how much arrests pretty much was we have done with regards to firearm trafficking. Law enforcement have had made arrests. As you can see, it has decreased even though firearm usage has increased. And interestingly, you can see that from this depiction, the northern regions will be the one with the highest set of arrests for firearms. Interestingly, in 2018, we had 422 from that region. And so the table kind of gives us some indication of how the arrest patterns are going for that period. I don't have it for the period of 2021 to 2024, but in 2020 there was a sort of anomaly because we had COVID-19. So we'll take that statistics really likely, and we'll have to readjust to see what happened after 21 to 23. Given these, just like some statistics, in 2018, 1,000 and over 1,752 persons were arrested in total. And that accounts for the northern region, which had 822 persons, 32 persons who were arrested. So we do have high arrest rates, even though they decreased in 2020. In general, we have very high arrest rates for firearm offenses. So why is this happening? And we have to look at the prevalence of gangs, because one of the things we looked at was the correlation between the number of gangs we have in Trinidad and Tobago and the high murder rates that we have. And research has shown that there has been a synonymous relationship and a positive, significant relationship with prevalence of gangs in Trinidad and Tobago and the murder rates. But not only murder, the use of firearms and gang-related activities. And I'll get into that in a little bit, right? So for the period 2000 to 2002, there were 9,100 murders on average that was committed in Trinidad and Tobago. Out of that figure, 6,800 were committed by firearms, which was really high. And so the data shows this period where in 2022, you have like the highest set of murders that were happening in Trinidad and Tobago, which was 605. So one of the things they looked at is what are the causes of this? And so there are other reasons for this cause, but we found that the prevalence of gangs were one of the major reasons. But other reasons, and I will just state it because I think it should be noted, that the country's the decreasing idea of humanity, the social effects, economic and political consequences are seen as some, and I will give you some examples. They talked about limited poor governance. Some of the research talked about poverty, limitations in the access to resources, corruption, exploitation, and to top it off, drug use and drug trafficking as well has led to some of the correlations with the high levels of firearms and in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as high levels of gang violence. Sorry, the high levels of firearms within the country. And so when we look at the presence of street gangs, it happened over the last 4 decades. And over that period of time, we realized that there was important factors with the misuse of firearms. And when I said I'll get into some of the things that gangs have initiated with the use of firearms, I'm not only talking about murders, I'm talking about a lot of other types of crimes, right? So you have robberies. They also initiate things like hit for hire. We now have extortion as a major problem. In addition to the actual sale of the gun, like that's actually a business within these gangs. And so when you look at Trinidad, you recognize that the gang problem exceeds any of the other Eastern and Southern Caribbean islands. And the number of gang-related murders relatively comes as no surprise. So the engagement of gangs in trafficking and the misuse of firearms fuel a large proportion of the murders in Trinidad and Tobago, with the association to about approximately 40% of the annual homicide rate. And this was actually taken from empirical data. And so Trinidad and Tobago on murders for 2000 to 2022 kind of underscores the seriousness of the gang-related problems. We have had this problem domineering for all these decades. And so 95% really of these murders were committed with the use of firearm throughout that period. And so why is it still brewing if it was a problem? So the findings suggest that the access to firearms is one of the biggest issues. It is becoming too easy to access these firearms. And then the willingness of our population to commit acts of violence with these firearms. So this has been like exacerbated, and we see it as a real problem. So not only is there are a lot of gangs, but the culture within gangs, the mentality or the way in which, or the psyche behind use of guns has changed, where it was just an anomaly. Now it's actually becoming much more popular. And so people are well acquainted with guns, even those who are not in gangs. So that is one reason. Another reason that we have looked at in research for the prevalence of gun is just the locale of Trinidad and Tobago, but it's coupled with other factors. The country's vulnerability is one, because we have porous borders, but also we lack a lot of the resources to actually detect for the seizure of guns within the ports. And of course, with surveillance, there has been a lot of smuggling on the sea boats. And so it's entering the country through these illegal ports throughout Trinidad, our coastline, especially Southwestern Peninsula. And that provides an ideal location for the smuggling of these firearms from neighboring Venezuela. So increasing demand, of course, is led to the increase of the importation. So it's not only the fact that it's coming in the countries that we are actually buying them on the street. We are demanding firearms from North America as well as Venezuela, and which often enter the country through legal ports of entry, and because of that, it's pretty disturbing. So it's really ineffective scanning of these shipping containers through the legal ports, or it's just the absence of them. But the capability of these security officials at these ports of entry may also be brought to question, and the lack of ability to have the resources to resolve the issue of the guns coming in. So this research that we did, it pretty much looks at 30 prisoners, and this is again from the small arms survey that was conducted under CARICOM Impacts. 10 of these participants were prisoners from the Port of Spain, 11 was from Carrera, and 9 was from Maximum Prison. And they were randomly selected from the 3 prisons, but they all faced charges of firearm possession or either firearm trafficking. And with this sample, we were able to get a lot of information regarding the demographic of the participants. They range from 18 to over even 65. I think the older was 78, if I'm not mistaken. And they were of various, most of lower income. And only one person had tertiary level education, but the majority of them were of primary school, not even completing primary school. So that means lower levels of education, and a lot of them attended secondary school, but didn't really complete successfully. And so looking at that, we kind of analyzed the data. We kind of twisted around from the survey it initially came from, and did a qualitative approach in terms of doing a thematic analysis using Max QDA. And that helped us identify some of the patterns and the co-concurrence with the analysis. So it looks at the codes and see what similarities there are with some of the responses of these participants. So coming out of the data on these interviews, I'll move very quickly because I know my time is always up. Gang membership, as supported by the research previously done, has been 32% of them, of the participants basically said, yes, I am a member of a gang and I do participate in firearms trafficking. And this is some of the quotation: because of my area, my community, which I'm part of, we can't get away from it. We are in gangs, and illicit weaponry is usually what the gangs require, and especially to carry out. And as again, it confirmed that it's not only murders, it's a host of other gang-related activities. The economic situation, employment within specific areas, which is unemployment. A lot of them use it for the economic situations in terms of finding work, selling and buying, and also hit for hire. These are an extortion. And peer pressure. There are a lot of people within their communities where it is such a norm to have a firearm. They sell it on the street, they trade, and so a lot of the communities, it is no longer cliche to have firearms. So it's now something that is very dominant within these communities. a lot of 36% of the participants reported that it's mostly for protection. Now, some of these communities have a history of gang violence, and with a history of gang violence, there also comes revenge killings. There's more fear of being of retaliation, or just crossing the wrong, being in the wrong boundary, or just the encounters that they have within these communities. So they like to have the firearm for protection of self, not to use for any type of illicit activities or to be part of gangs, but just for protection. And 4% said it was work related, and this is where we get a little bit into the trafficking part of this. So firearms trafficking was part of the analysis, and we do have support that some of these participants did participate in firearm trafficking at one point, and so they would buy and sell, or they'd be part of the firearms trafficking trade, and so this is where they would have some of the income coming in. But also a lot of them would use legitimate firearms for service or whatever place of employment. And because of the security they felt having a firearm, they would actually purchase illicit firearm. So just tapping into the trafficking part of it, they did admit when the findings of these interviews that most of the trafficking, this is the persons who were involved in trafficking, the guns were trafficked from the United States, Venezuela, and there was actually a participant who was from Colombia who said that he knows that they trade guns with Colombia as well. And so you have these three countries being fully engrossed in the trafficking. And this is just for our records for the survey itself, and not general information or official statistics gained by our intelligence of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is the participants telling them of their personal experience with trafficking. And these are the guns that usually come in either through containers. They talked about having them on boats that come from Venezuela. They would conceal these things with fishing nets. And they also talked about having being inconspicuous and knowing how to time Coast Guard so that they would, especially on the times that they will be doing their patrol, they'll have decoy boats so that they will actually hide the boat on which all these firearms are on. And so it was really interesting information. They talked about these type of ways in which they would hide the firearms within, and that's why I have a picture of them in cereal boxes on the ports. So they hide them within food containers. They also said appliances and other clothing items. So these are some of the list of firearms models that were indicated from the participants that were trafficked into Trinidad. And you can see pistols are very high on the list at 41%. And then thereafter, we had like conversion devices as well as rifles. And we have revolvers as well. So key takeaway, so very quickly, there is a symbiotic relationship between street gangs and the misuse of firearms, but that is also linked to the inter-gang rivalry. So a lot of people look at it for protection. So gang still filters into a lot of the explanation. The revenge killings, the attacks on persons, rival gangs, and so forth. And even it's not even gangs, it's just specific areas somebody would reside in will make them a rival to a specific gang. So quickly, of course, I showed before Venezuela, Colombia, and the United States. They were three clearly indicated countries that traffic to our country of Trinidad and Tobago illegal firearms. And also socioeconomic factors, which also plays a critical role in why people have in possession of illicit firearms and they actually get involved in trafficking. So lastly, what do we do about it? How do we move forward? So looking at the research, we have to continue this emphasizing, the emphasis on dismantling gangs throughout the country. We have done it in the past, but we have the rising of more gangs and more gangs. So we still have to continue doing it, trying to use our legislation, which we already have, the Gang Violence Act, the Gangs Act, and we also have the initiative by the police, different units within the police service to, tap into getting rid of gangs or decreasing the volume of gangs within our country. We still have to use our population and our community and our citizenship free to basically eliminate firearms from communities, to put down the guns, cease fires, making bold, strong statements within communities that they're not going to tolerate guns. This is very difficult, especially within communities that have accepted guns as part of, a staple. So what do? We still have to emphasize on the top level and then the bottom level, how eliminating guns within your community is essential, and have forceful actions and activities to eliminate those firearms within these communities. Also, resources like add resources for border control. I know, like from years ago, we talked about OPVs patrolling our waters. So if you could strengthen our maritime and look at models on which they strengthen their maritimes in international and global countries, aerial surveillance as well, technology that they use now to tap in, so we can modernize our technology in terms of looking at guns, scanning for these firearms, and also upgrade our seizure exercises so that we'll have much more seizures of firearms, illicit firearms. And the last thing I'll talk about is just in those communities where there's a lot of firearms and gang violence, we could have like community-specific programs. I'm always an advocate for programming. So we design these programs suited for these communities rather than have a all-size-fit-one approach or a general approach. So we actually look at each community and how the guns are affecting them, or what is causing the gun violence to happen. I know it's a very daunting task. It's going to be a very dynamic process. But at the end of the day, if you look at the community itself and zone in, you might find some of these nitty-gritty ways in which you could improve the community and reduce gang violence, as well as the use of firearms in this community. So this comes to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. This is my contact. If you have any questions, you could always feel free to email me, or you could talk to the chair of this panel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Melissa. Transnationality, complexity, multidimensionality. Let me invite now Calixtus to give his presentation. Over to you, Calixtus.
Thank you, Chair Professor Ivor Griffith. I also wish to recognize Dr. Anita Montut, who is the Director of the Institute of International Relations. I'd also like to recognize my fellow panelists, Dr. Melissa, Mr. Ivan, and Mr. Bruce. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. Just 4 days ago, on 22nd September 2024, world leaders adopted a pact for the future. The pact aimed, above all, to ensure that international institutions can deliver in the face of a world that has changed dramatically since the end of the Cold War. The agreement of the pact is a strong statement of countries' commitment to the international system and international law. Some key deliverables in the pact include Action 18, which speaks to addressing the risk associated with illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, their parts and ammunition, or associated ammunition. We also have in the pact Action 26, which looks at strengthening our national and international efforts to combat, prevent, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, despite CARICOM states' smallness, which contributes to small island developing states' diplomatic challenges and can impact negatively in terms of their effectiveness in terms of negotiation, CARICOM states have been at the forefront at the international level with regard to promoting arms control and non-proliferation. And as recognized from the slide up here, you could see that most Caribbean states are signatories to most of the international instruments when it relates to arms transfer, arms control, including the Arms Trade Treaty, SIFTA, the UN Firearms Protocol, the Caribbean Firearms Roadmap, and the UN Program of Action. This shows CARICOM and CARICOM heads of government commitment towards arms control. Now, while there are many other factors, the high level of violence and homicides in the Caribbean is often associated with three intertwined factors. I would say gang violence, drug trafficking, and the access to illicit firearms. We could state that firearms are the lifeblood of organized crime and gun violence in CARICOM states. The illicit trafficking and misuse of firearms is intrinsically linked to criminals and gangs as facilitators of violent crime, as tools to perpetrate power, and as lucrative trafficking commodities that fuel armed violence, crime, and insecurity. Oftentimes, different forms of criminality are intertwined, such as human, firearms, and drug trafficking. Now, Dr. Melissa spoke earlier to homicide rates in Trinidad and Tobago. In CARICOM as a whole, illicit firearms is responsible for 80% of homicide. In some countries, more than 90%, compared to the global average of 54%. The rate of violent death in the Caribbean is almost 3 times the global average. And that's quite menacing. Whether firearms is used to intimidate and coerce victims, illicit firearms are the instrument or the tool used in most crimes. So the illicit trade in firearms constitutes a huge impediment to peace, sustainable development, security, and social development, as well as human well-being, ultimately impeding achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The use of illicit firearms affect livelihoods, and life opportunities. It is one of the biggest impediments to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, I repeat. Now, we must recognize that firearms play a key role in all aspects of trafficking, not just as a traffic commodity, but as a means of facilitating the trafficking of other commodities, such as human and drug trafficking, and as a tool to support criminal and defiant behavior, such as gang violence, organized criminality, terrorism, robberies, rape, and other forms of sexual and non-sexual violence. Case study research in the Bahamas, Barbados, and Jamaica revealed that firearms-related violence impose significant public health and economic burdens on CARICOM community and societies. In 2019, the direct medical cost and productivity loss due to firearms-related violence amounted to at least $12 million in Barbados, 49 million in the Bahamas, and 135 million in Jamaica. This figure is an underestimate, and it underestimates the total impact of firearms violence on health. Beyond these deaths, many victims suffer from injuries, disabilities, and ill health due to violence. Dr. Melissa previously spoke to the issue of research done by CARICOM Impacts and Small Arms Survey, and she did mention research done in Trinidad and Tobago. This research was also extended to 2 other countries, including Belize and Suriname. What the research revealed is that firearms are usually acquired at a very young age. And in terms of the risk factors, these include persons with very low educational attainment, including a high rate of dropping out of school. So we may ask ourselves, where does all those firearms come from? The US domestic market is the major source of illicit firearms and ammunition in the Caribbean, and is likely the largest source in some states and territories. More than 70%, and for some states, perhaps 90% and above, of the firearms come from the US, and the exception would be Belize, whereby 70% of the illegal firearms are sourced from Guatemala, and 25% of the illegal firearms are sourced from Honduras, according to Trace data. Firearms and ammunition are trafficked to the Caribbean via commercial airlines, postal and fast parcel services, and maritime shipping companies. Although the primary transport mode varies from country to country, firearms trafficking via maritime cargo shipment is particularly common in the Caribbean. So what are some of the current trends in terms of the illicit firearms trend in the Caribbean? There is increased use of national or local post office courier companies, where a lot of parts and components of firearms are sent there. From 2023, April 2023, we've seen significant seizures of privately made pistols, rifles, and their parts in the region. We've also seen the dismantlement of 3D printed firearms workshop in the region and the continued proliferation of what you call conversion devices. A huge phenomena in the region now is the issue of 3D printed firearms. 3D printing is a significant innovation in small arms manufacturing. Of particular concern is the availability of this technology for criminals and terrorist activities. 3D printing is expected to become a lucrative alternative for small-scale weapons manufacturing and sale. Now, previously, in terms of our lobbying of arms control, we mentioned that CARICOM states are not large-scale, are not producers of firearms. With the advent of 3D printers, what we have noticed in a few states that there are persons who are printing weapons from 3D workshops in the region. So this is a new phenomenon. Although the issue of 3D printing has been on the international agenda since 2013, so it's more than 10 years. And usually we say whatever happened in one area of the world will find itself in the region or in another part of the world. And guess what? The issue of 3D printing has found itself in the Caribbean. But another phenomenon is what you call conversion devices. And what are those conversion devices? The issue of conversion devices basically changes, especially pistols, from semi-automatic to fully automatic weapons. So what does this mean? It increases the risk of multiple injuries occurring at once. So those are some of the latest trends occurring in the region. So what are some of the key challenges? As noted earlier, porous borders and multiple entry points. Commercial inbound containers, meaning that many containers coming from, let's say, the US will not be thoroughly checked. As with any customs department will check customers they receive, containers they receive more than containers that have been sent out. So similarly with any country, it will be the same for the US also. Demand for illicit and legal firearms. We must recognize that there is an issue, and the issue is that there is a demand for those illicit weapons in the region. The issue of parcel and postal operators, which are not trained and do not have the capacity in terms of the detection of firearms. And criminals have recognized this, and many firearms are sent through parcel and postal operators. And the global increase in personally made firearms. We spoke about the 3D weapons. We have what you call 80% receivers, and we have what you call ghost guns, meaning that they do not have any serial numbers on them. Now, what are some of the programs which have been implemented by CARICOM Impacts? In terms of firearms programming, you must recognize that programming must entail both the legal trade and the illicit trade. So first of all, you must safeguard the licit market or the legal market and limit diversion into the illicit market. And some of the, but we must also recognize that no country can do it on its own. No region can do it on its own. And only through partnership could we solve the gun issue we have in the region. Noting that CARICOM Impacts have embarked on a number of initiatives, including partnering and having officers attached from many agencies within CARICOM Impacts. Key to some of those programs include information intelligence sharing, where we have established a CARICOM Gun Crime Intelligence Unit. Also, in terms of ballistic sharing, we have established frameworks for sharing ballistic among CARICOM member states in the region, strengthening the legal arms trade, especially weapons which the police have, the law enforcement have, including strengthening national institutions such as weapons and ammunition management, enhancing domain awareness, including establishing a CARICOM cyber fusion unit, importantly, advancing research, and more recently, we released the CARICOM firearm study, along with our partners from the Small Arms Survey, from U.W.I, and from CAFA. Also, the provision of tools to member states, and also many operations which we do at CARICOM Impacts. But importantly, as stated earlier, no state can do it alone. And the Caribbean region cannot do it alone. Our heads of government have lobbied the United States of government, given that more than 80% for many countries, the illicit weapons come from there. Some of the programs which we have lobbied for include the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which dramatically increased criminal penalties for what you call straw purchases and U.S. source firearms trafficking in America. More recently, we had the Stop Illegal Trafficking in Firearms Act in America, which assigned further penalties for smuggled firearms or ammunition out of the United States with intent to support transnational organized crime. Earlier this year, a coordinator for Caribbean firearms prosecution, that was in July 2023, the Department of Justice appointed an experienced prosecutor to the role to elevate firearms trafficking investigations and prosecutions and help implement the provisions of the Bipartisan Safer Community Act. All of those initiatives were promoted and were advanced through lobbying through CARICOM heads of government, among others. Some of the key recommendations, research and reporting on pathways into and existing gangs. So whilst we spoke about the nexus, and Dr. Melissa spoke about the nexus between gang trafficking, gangs, and guns, a key issue is, what are the pathways in terms of existing gangs? Positive mentorship and reinforcing the role of parents and build community resilience. We also need to take care of our prisons. Why do I say that? Many countries in the Caribbean have a high rate of recidivism. Some countries more than 50%. Perhaps if we solve the issue of prisons, we could solve the issue of criminality in the region. We also need to strengthen our criminal justice responses for investigation and prosecution. Many countries have very low rate of prosecution, and this gives criminals even an incentive to commit the heinous crimes. Also, we need to establish regulatory measures to curb the proliferation of 3D printed firearms, and importantly, address the issue of corruption. Many of our illicit firearms are coming from our legal ports. Our legal ports, I repeat. And one of the reasons it's coming out there is the issue of corruption. So we need to address this issue. I'd like to thank the Institute of International Relations and their partners for inviting me to this webinar. And thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Calixtus. And again, Calixtus provides a wealth of evidence that transnationality, complexity, multidimensionality are the three defining characteristics of this reality we face. Let me invite now Mr. Ivan Carpio to offer his presentation. Ivan?
Thank you. If I can cheat a bit, I will stand on the protocol already having been established, but express my gratitude for having been invited to join this panel, and to Dr. Griffith and my fellow panelists and hosts. My name is Ivan Carpio. I work in the Department of State's Office of Caribbean Affairs in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs as a coordinator for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. I've been in this role for about 4.5 years, and prior to this, I worked in the Bureau of International Narcotics Law Enforcement Affairs, with much of this time working on the CBSI programs under INL's purview. Slide, please. If you take my presentation today, I want it to be that disrupting illicit firearms trafficking is a shared priority for the United States. And it's a priority that we share with our Caribbean partners, and an important aspect of our cooperation to address rising levels of crime and violence in the region. And echoing some themes from Mr. Calixtus Joseph's presentation, we recognize illicit firearms trafficking as an aspect of a broader set of security challenges, including transnational organized crime and drug trafficking. Accordingly, we recognize these issues as a shared responsibility. Next. I'm going to focus on highlighting some of our key regional efforts. This is not an exhaustive list. Cooperation on these issue areas extends across the region. And for my geographic remit, this entails work across 7 U.S. and 13 countries under CBSI, including bilateral efforts that aren't going to be fully accounted for in this discussion. And one other thing I want to touch on is this is consistent with what other panelists have addressed, but the major issue in the region is illicit firearms trafficking. And this includes illicit firearms trafficking originating from the United States. Slide, please. Since 2010, the United States has worked with our partners through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative to reduce trafficking, strengthen citizen security, and prevent youth crime and violence. Since 2010, the United States has committed more than $1 billion in programming, including equipment, training, and technical assistance. This includes support for bringing together discussions. This includes technical level engagements. It's kind of the breadth of the remit of capacity building being the focus, and with the aim to try to support capacity building sustainably. And to say the firearms trafficking key piece, but the initiative is broader than that. It is illicit firearms trafficking, border and port security, maritime law enforcement, countering transnational organized crime, and preventing youth crime and violence. And again, it's specific 15 countries listed here, and the way we implement this program, there are 3 sort of funded elements of CBSI: the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and the United States Agency for International Development. In my role, it's the sort of policy piece that helps bring together these other elements. And I work with our country desk officers, who are counterparts, local section embassies, deputy chief of mission, and chiefs of mission in the region. So we're just kind of bringing this effort together. Much of what I will touch on today falls under INL's part of CBSI, that programmatic piece that they support, and this includes our work with our U.S. interagency partners. Slide, please. So each year under CBSI, we do a series of technical working group meetings, or TWGs, and each of these meetings addresses a specific set of that affects all of our partner countries, with the goal of identifying policy recommendations, technical capacity building needs, and best practices to overcome those challenges. We take the information from those technical working group meetings. It builds up towards a ministerial level meeting that we do about once a year, and that is where we review progress under this initiative, the programming under this initiative, and we set out our planning for the next year. So last November, St. Lucia hosted the dialogue sessions focused on firearms trafficking, countering transnational organized crime, maritime security, youth crime violence prevention. And that coincided with, or I'll credit to CARICOM Impact for this. It happened the same week as that firearms roadmap meeting, the meeting of states parties. The next slide, please. So this is a big wall of text. I don't expect you to read this. I can send this in the chat, a link to this in the chat. But this is just an excerpt from the dialogue joint statement from 2023. This is going to, as I go through the rest of my my remarks, you'll see that what I'm highlighting here fits with what we are prior in the programmatic space. This is what was adopted at the ministerial level, security ministers from CARICOM with the Dominican Republic. This is this is an important part of it, but this is an excerpt of a larger document. So we negotiate, we talk about these commitments. You will see some elements here that we've already discussed, and I will go into more detail on much of this. Just to clarify too, this was unanimously adopted at the conclusion of our dialogue in St. Lucia in 2023. Next slide, please. Okay, so in January 2019, the United States, CARICOM, and the Dominican Republic convened a technical working group meeting on combating illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons in the Caribbean. At that meeting, participants developed a list of priority actions that identify reforms and opportunities for regional coordination to address firearms trafficking more effectively. And in May of CARICOM heads of government formally adopted those priority actions. We had another meeting of the Firearms Technical Working Group meeting in April 2023. We identified 18 additional priority actions, elevated those for consideration. And that, building on the priority actions, CARICOM Impacts and United Nations Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament, and Development in Latin America, or UN LYRIC, engaged on the development of the Caribbean Fire Map, which builds out the timelines for implementation. It builds out the roadmap to a greater level. To date, and following through on the roadmap, we have countries that are developing and approving national plans, and 8 countries have developed and adopted national action plans to date. I understand there are 4 others that are progressing towards that goal. And as we talk about, without getting too far into the bilateral piece, there's a thought of, as each develops its roadmap, that's another opportunity to engage and see how we can support implementation of that roadmap as the United States. Next slide, please. I was a little conflicted about where to put this, and it's a bit of a confusing slide, but there are a lot of U.S. interagency components involved in this endeavor. I wanted to highlight that and to just talk a little bit about different pieces of this. I've spoken a bit about the CBSI components, but let me just talk a little bit about U.S. interagency roles and responsibilities. So there's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF. ATF investigates U.S. federal offenses involving the unlawful use, manufacture, and possession of explosives, and regulates U.S. firearms imports and sales. We have ATF attaches in Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Trinidad, who work with Caribbean law enforcement partners to investigate illegal firearms trafficking cases. We have Homeland investigations. HSI enforces U.S. export laws and investigates firearms and ammunition smuggling operations violating those laws. HSI has increased its footprint by opening offices in Port-au-Prince, the Bahamas, and in Bridgetown, in addition to existing offices in Santo Domingo, Nassau, and Kingston. And HSI supports vetted transactional criminal investigative units in Jamaica and the Dominican Republic, and stand one up in Haiti. Customs and Border Protection enforces U.S. export laws and works with Caribbean partners to screen passengers and cargo transiting the region. They're the unified border agency within the Department of Homeland Security, work to promote information sharing, advance investigations, identify linkages related to transnational crime, and coordinate between U.S. and Caribbean ports of entry. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industrial Security, licenses firearms, its commerce control list, and commerce, the Office of Export Enforcement serves as an investigative arm of BIS and enforces U.S. export laws. So those components I just mentioned are tied in an intelligence unit. Those are the U.S. components that are engaging with the Crime Gun Intelligence Unit in an investigative matter. They are kind of the lead on that part of the cooperation. Going back, Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. INL supports coordination, training, technical assistance for partners working to reduce the flow of illicit firearms and ammunition through the region. So it's that capacity building piece again. Separate from CBS, it's a little bit confusing because political military affairs comes up twice, but there is an Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement who manages the Department of State's conventional weapons destruction program. Bear with me. That's it for this piece. Slide, please. So just to focus in two big picture goals, capacity building, the part that I'm speaking to, what my initiative that I work on with our partners focuses on is this capacity building piece. And then we work a lot with my U.S. interagency partners. They're focused on the cross-border investigative coordination that drives that case piece of it. Slide, please. So when we look at what do we need to develop leads for cross-border investigations, or how does that piece of this cooperation happen? A lot of that is focused on this E-Trace system that falls under ATF's purview. And what we ask for from our partners is to communicate this information of recovered crime guns so we can look at the information related to those firearms in our databases, identify linkages. Those linkages can help us identify the origin of these crime guns to track what processes that where they have transited, to develop those linkages that can help us identify illicit drug trafficking and illicit drug traffickers. So I wanted to start with this slide because this is critically important. We have a lot of support. We have a lot of commitments at high levels from our Caribbean partners to work with us on this. A lot of our engagement is supported, or a lot of our engagement supports this as well. But just really want to highlight this as a key piece, because if we don't have this, it's a lot more difficult to identify what the trends are or to identify those linkages. So the sort of broader from the United States and the focus is getting this information into these systems so that we can identify those linkages and follow through on the U.S. side as well. There are memoranda of understanding with all the Caribbean countries. The last outstanding MOU was signed with Haiti, also on, I keep bringing up the dialogue in St. Lucia in November 2023, but also that same week. And we would like to build towards 100% tracing. We're not quite there. Slide, please. Calixtus already spoke to the Crime Gun Intelligence Unit. This is CARICOM's unit. I had the privilege of being around when some CARICOM leadership came up to DC, met with ATF, talked through a model that the United States uses for sharing crime gun intelligence. And I just really want to the credit goes to CARICOM Impacts for standing this up, for undertaking that effort, and to building this that can then focus other cooperative elements around the CGIU. So the HSI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Bureau of Industrial Security, they all work with the CGIU. Additionally, there's programmatic support and sort of a training focus that reinforces the work of the CGIU. And the CGIU is doing sensitization visits in the region. There's a lot of the capacity building work that's channeled in cooperation with, or really through the CGIU and focused on the CGIU. So this is really kind of a remarkable effort that the United States is proud to support, and it is a Caribbean effort. This includes that E-Trace piece that I mentioned. This includes training initiatives more broadly. Let's see. Seizure supports, CGIU supports the seizure of firearms, related parts, components, as well as in identifying, charging, supporting the prosecution of co-conspirators, uses modern intelligence tools to promote the development and sharing of crime gun intelligence regionally. And the CGIU is located in CARICOM Impact's Port of Spain headquarters, works with the Regional Intelligence Fusion Center under Impacts, and also with the Joint Regional Communications Center, but I understand falls under the remit of Impacts. Slide, please. I'm gonna, this part is gonna be a few different programs. I'm just gonna, recognizing time constraints, I'm gonna hit this at a pretty high, but mostly just wanna communicate just how many different areas that there are engagements happening. So we've got a project supported through INL that's focused on building small arms and capacity to detect light weapons in customs institutions. The implementer is the World Customs Organization, and this is really just to support our collaboratively strengthen customs and border controls to reduce the risk of illicit traffickings and ammunition to the Caribbean. This includes interdiction training for customs agencies at port and border crossings, and this just also engages on the security aspects of customs. Slide, please. The Department of State Regional Forensic Accreditation Project is helping Caribbean forensic institutions meet international standards, building towards international IOS, International Organization for Standardization Accreditation. There has been work to a regional center of excellence in St. Lucia, and this also includes support to forensic laboratories in the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic. Slide, please. Oh, okay. I'm getting the time up, but if I could just things, stockpile security and management this is a project that launched in May, or relaunched, but there's been different iterations of this. This is building on something that CARICOM Impacts has been doing, just to say the United States is also invested in this element of this. Slide, please. Actually, if you could skip forward 2 slides, because Calixtus already spoke a little bit about the DOJ coordinator for Caribbean firearms prosecutions in the BSCA. I'm gonna just lightning round touch on a few other things happening. Just general focus on capacity. In 2023, ATF supported training for 270 Caribbean police officers on firearms investigations, including familiarization training on privately made firearms, ghost guns, and 3D printed firearms. Operation Hammerhead, through Caribbean partners, this joint operation resulted in seizures of 339 firearms, 26,495 rounds of ammunition, and over 400 magazines. And then also last year, in advance of the 2023 holiday season, based on engagement with Caribbean partners, surged resources to screen outbound cargo from the United States to the Caribbean. And this allowed us to sort of engage on a potential vector for firearms trafficking out of the United States. I will stop there. Thank you for indulging me with a little bit of extra time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carpio. Let's continue with last but not least, Bruce. Over to you, Bruce.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
So I will talk about, is litigation part of the solution? This is a relatively new technique that has been tried. Next slide, please. So in addition to my PowerPoint, I've given the organizers 6 small articles on this issue that you can get from the organizer, I think, after the program. And the litigation, this is civil litigation, offers the potential of depriving the gun manufacturers and distributors of the reason for manufacturing and distributing. It's all about money. That goes to 2 of the comments in the chat about corruption. And one of them said it's corruption in the Caribbean, but it's not just in the Caribbean. I mean, it's all over the world. The people that are making and distributing illegal firearms are doing it for only one reason. They want to make money. So my presentation discusses a couple of cases brought by the Mexican government in the US, and also one case brought in Canada against a gun distributor. And then I'll look at some international human rights initiatives. This is very similar to litigation, but in international human rights tribunals. And then I ask whether litigation can be brought outside the US, including in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So in the first case I want to discuss, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico brought an action in the US District Court in Massachusetts against 6 gun manufacturers, saying that they're liable because they purposely designed, they purposely marketed, and they purposely distributed their weapons of war. A lot of these were like machine guns and so forth, in a way that the Mexican cartels could use them. The district court dismissed the case, but it was appealed, and the Court of Appeals in January of 2024 overturned the dismissal. Now, the district court mainly dismissed it because it said the claims were barred by the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which has the acronym PLATCA. This law was adopted in 2005 by Congress at the insistence of the gun lobby. And it basically gives very broad immunity to gun manufacturers and distributors. So, and by the way, 6 CARICOM governments were part of the case and filed amicus briefs, on behalf of the Mexican government. So on appeal, the Court of Appeals said that the defendants knowingly or that Mexico had shown enough evidence to show that the gun manufacturers and one distributor knowingly violated predicate statutes by aiding and abetting illegal downstream sales and by selling unlawful machine guns. Next slide, please. So now the gun manufacturers have filed in the US Supreme Court a petition for certiorari. And the questions they presented are whether the production and sale of firearms in the US is the proximate cause of the alleged injuries to the Mexican government stemming from violence committed by drug cartels in Mexico. I mean, they basically argue that, look, there's all kinds of other intermediaries that are the proximate cause, and that therefore the court should throw out the case because the manufacturers aren't the proximate cause. I mean, actually, the Court of Appeals held that while the manufacturers weren't the sole proximate cause, that they were, they played an important part of the proximate cause. The other issue that the gun manufacturers raised is whether the production and sale of firearms in the U.S. amounts to aiding and abetting illegal firearms trafficking, because firearms companies allegedly know that some of their products are unlawfully trafficked. These issues are not that strong, and even though the U.S. Supreme Court only takes less than 2% of petitions for certiorari, one unique aspect about this case is there's an amicus brief by 27 Republican members of Congress, one of which is from a gun lobby. The brief was actually, one of the briefs was signed by Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, and they have a lot of allies on the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a conference on September 30 in the Supreme Court to decide whether they're going to take the case. So stay tuned, because in a few days we should have more information on that. Next slide, please. So the Mexican government also brought a lawsuit in October 2022, this time in the District of Arizona. It was the first lawsuit alleging racketeering claims against the gun industry, and the first case brought by a sovereign country against the gun dealers. The gun dealers moved to dismiss, but on March 24th of this year, the U.S. District Court in Arizona held that the government of Mexico could proceed in its case against 5 gun dealers, denying the defendant's motion to dismiss most of the claims. Next slide, please. So, well, I should say that the court said that Mexico could proceed with its claims of negligence, gross negligence, unjust enrichment, and that their demand for punitive damages could continue. It did dismiss the RICO claims. And the district court said, look, there's a lot of red flags in this case. We see a lot of straw sales. Straw sales mean that the dealer is selling to someone not to use for himself, but it looks like he's really just an intermediary for other people. The court also said Mexico had shown a lot of bulk sales, in other words, selling multiple weapons of war. The court also said Mexico had shown a lot of cash sales and repeat sales of military-style weapons. The court also said, look, Mexico has also showed that these 5 gun dealers were responsible for quite a bit of the sale, the distribution of weapons of war in Mexico, and they've shown that this has gone on for quite a long time, and therefore the case can continue. So let me now turn to a third case. This one was brought by victims of mass shooting in Toronto, and it was brought against Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson moved to dismiss, and on February 11, 2021, the court denied the motion to dismiss. So the litigation is still going. The case involves a man who used a stolen handgun that was actually sold to the police in Canada. And he randomly started shooting and killing people in Toronto and eventually shot himself. So two of the persons injured, they started a proposed class action against Smith & Wesson, and on the basis of negligent design, negligent manufacture and or distribution, public nuisance, and strict liability. Next slide, please. So the plaintiff said Smith & Wesson owed a duty of care to ensure that the handguns it designed, manufactured, and made available for sale in Canada included safe gun technology so as to prevent and deter substantial and foreseeable harm. So by the way, before the 2005 PLATCA was enacted, some gun manufacturers did use safe technology. So for instance, there's technology so that unless you use the right fingerprint or that you show that you are the authorized user, the gun is not going to work. But once the PLATCA was enacted, gun manufacturers, because they have broad immunity, they stopped using this technology. So the defendant unsuccessfully moved to strike the claim as disclosing no reasonable cause of action. So this case is especially important for the Caribbean because, of course, Caribbean uses Commonwealth law jurisprudence, which although there's some similarities with the US, there's also some differences. This case was also brought by a large law firm called Gowling. Next slide, please. So another way, next slide, please. Another way to go after the gun manufacturers and against the governments wherein the gun manufacturers and dealers are doing business is to bring claims in international human rights tribunals. Because there are all kinds of international human rights guaranteed by the various conventions that I mentioned in the slide, like the right to life, liberty, and personal security, the right to equality before the law, the right to family, the right to a fair trial. So for instance, if you're a victim of, let's say, mass gun violence, you have a right to a fair trial. Next slide, please. And so, one way to, again, go after not only the gun manufacturers and dealers, but also the governments responsible for regulating these gun manufacturers and dealers is to bring actions in international human rights tribunals. And again, the Mexican government has taken the lead. So for instance, in November of 2023, the Mexican government brought an action in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Well, it did it before November 2023, but there was a hearing on November 28, 29 in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica. And there were 64 briefs submitted. 62 supported Mexico's claim that the United States has to regulate and adopt domestic legislation that controls and monitors the marketing, done by the firearms industry, the representatives of Bolivia and Colombia, as well as organizations from Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil, also referred to their problems that result. And several participants, well, the court showed great interest in the types of practices that would exemplify a lack of due diligence on the part of arms companies that would facilitate illicit arms trafficking. Several participants presented examples such as lack of safety mechanisms in the guns, the ease with which they can be modified, the lack of background checks on people buying guns, the absence of traceability mechanisms, the marketing of guns to children and adolescents, and their promotion of criminal use of guns, among others. So also in November of 2023, there was an action in the Inter-American Human Rights Commission brought by the parents of Joaquin Oliver, one of the high school students killed in Parkland, Florida by the mass gun shooting. And again, that was on, claiming that the U.S. government has to do more to regulate the manufacturers and dealers. Next slide, please. So finally, the question is, okay, some of these lawsuits have been brought in the US and Canada, but I say, why not explore bringing them in the Caribbean? Especially since Caribbean governments now have had several meetings with respect to the fact that gun violence is a public health problem. Actually, they called it an emergency. And one of the problems is, I mean, I have called and talked to a couple of lawyers in the region and said, you know, why can't we bring one of these cases? I've said we may be able to provide financing for you. One of the issues is jurisdiction. You know, can Caribbean courts have and maintain jurisdiction when some of the activity is in the U.S. Or outside the Caribbean? Because the gun manufacturers have a lot of money. There's a question of, you know, can they match the funding? Also, these are complex cases, and there's a question of whether the Caribbean governments, I mean, the Caribbean law firms can bring such cases. You know, obviously they could have assistance from law firms outside of the Caribbean. And then a couple of other issues are enforcement of judgments. If you can bring a successful case, you also want to do it in a way where you're going to be able to enforce your judgment. And finally, even if you don't win these cases initially, there is an educational aspect about bringing these companies into court, not only in the US, but in the Caribbean. And with that, let me stop, and I look forward to discussions with both my fellow panelists and the audience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful, Bruce. Very comprehensive survey of the legal and broader human rights scene. We move now into the segment for questions and comments. What I'd like to do is to extract two at a time questions that have been posed. And I love to invite the panelists to ruminate on any or all of them, mindful of the brevity needed to facilitate as many questions as possible. So here are the first two questions. They both are country specific. One has to do with enabling us to have a better sense of the dynamic of trafficking involving Venezuela, movement of weapons from Venezuela to other countries in the area. I'd love to have someone comment on that. And there's also an interest in learning what's the rationale for the United States still defining Jamaica as a major drug trafficking drug transit country, given the reduction in recent time of the drug trafficking between the United States and Jamaica. See if we can have comments on those two questions first, and then we'll take a second round and go on. Let me turn first to the order in which we heard the presentations. Melissa?
Okay, thank you. So regarding question about Venezuela, the research shows, and I mean, a lot of the data that we collected, and based on like the interviews and research, there has been evidence to suggest that it goes both ways, not only just Trinidad getting guns from Venezuela, but vice versa. And so the idea of Venezuela contributing to, and I don't know exactly where the question was going in terms of asking about Venezuela. There has been, because I guess of one economic situation in Venezuela, they are selling guns, used guns, old guns, military guns to Trinidadians. They also manufacturing the 3D guns. And they're able to provide through whatever means channels, these porous borders that we have, fishing pirogues from what I read. And from the interviews, a lot of the participants, or I say inmates, would have who were charged with trafficking. They admitted to being a part of a trafficking ring with Venezuela. This is not to say the majority of the guns come from Venezuela. We're saying that there is some level of transaction that happens. And a lot of it comes from the economic instability of the country. And even with a few of the participants saying that they would actually trade the guns that they have for just food items or just items, not necessarily money. Although a lot of money transaction happens. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question, because I don't know where the depth of the question was going, but there is a level of evidence to suggest there is some level of transaction with firearm trafficking.
Anything on the Jamaica issue? If not, we'll move to Calixtus.
I think Alexis will better answer the Jamaica issue.
Alexis, anything on Venezuela and or Jamaica?
Thank you. I heard the Venezuela question, but I'm not too sure of what the Jamaican question was. But with regard to the Venezuelan question, what the trace data shows, the evidence is that countries which are closer to the north, meaning North America, majority of the weapons, you could say 85% and above, would come from America in terms of the source country. It doesn't mean that those weapons were manufactured in America, but that's a source country in terms of the diversion from the illicit to the illicit trade. That would be from e-trace data. Countries closer to the south, which is closer to Venezuela, we'll see less weapons. And when I mean less weapon, it does not mean that it's significantly less. So for instance, for Trinidad and Tobago, the data I looked at a few years ago, that's in around 2019, around 60% of the weapons at that time came from North America. However, there is no, I would say, data stating exactly where the other 40% come from. But to make a reasonable conclusion, it will come from areas closer to Trinidad and Tobago.
Let me reframe what the Jamaica question was, and maybe Mr. Karp, you can also offer a comment. The questioner wanted to know what's the rationale for the United States still defining Jamaica as a major drug trafficking country, given the fact that there's been a decline in trafficking between Jamaica and the United States in recent years.
So I found the memorandum, and I'm sharing the link here. and there's a lot in here. The sort of key part here that I want to read out loud is a country's presence on the foregoing list is not necessarily a reflection of its government's counter-drug efforts or level of cooperation with the United States. This is a requirement that that the department engages on this as a part of the INCSER report. I'm risking getting too far into the weeds, but there's different reasons Congress asks us to engage on this report, and the subsets of law that inform how the report is developed are referenced in that link. Sorry to give such a kind of broad answer, but I think the thing that I really want to stress is just that it's not a reflection of the counter drug effort or level of cooperation. It's more factors in that.
Okay, thank you.
And just on the E-Trade, Calixtus was saying, I'm afraid I don't have. I'd have to defer to, well, Calixtus I think would be able to get the data. We have ATF folks embedded with the Crime Gun Intelligence Unit. The factor, if we're looking at E-Trace data, a limiting factor is we're also looking at the data that is in the firearms that were recovered from the region, which sort of on an assumption that that's reflective of every firearm recovered. But if it's not, then that also could potentially bit. But I don't have that on hand, but I think that might be something that yeah, I'm not sure the extent to which that that data would be available, but it's not compiled anywhere to my knowledge right now.
Okay, thank you. Let me use the moderator's prerogative to pose a question. Perhaps Bruce and Calixtus might want to take a shot at the question. Bruce, I'd love to hear you ponder what might be some next steps in a possible litigation journey of Caribbean countries. What might be the next 2 or 3 things done with Caribbean countries or Caribbean legal professionals to make that journey a feasible one? And I'd love to hear Calixtus's thoughts as well.
Yes, I would say that I would convene a conference of attorneys general and some of the key players in the current litigation. One would be the Global Action on Gun Violence that has been representing the Mexican government. Another would be this law firm Gowling in Canada. And at that conference, you know, the different issues would be discussed, and afterwards there would be some kind of a game plan going forward, because without these suits to get at the money, because it's the money that not only makes the manufacturers and distributors illicitly distribute, but they also finance members of Congress, which then, you know, refuse to pass the legislation. So that's what I would, I mean, for instance, I'm going to Brazil in November, and I'm having a meeting with one of the NGOs in Brazil that's interested in this issue, along with some Brazilian lawyers.
Great. Calixtus, any thoughts?
Thank you, Professor. We must remember during the last declaration, which heads of government present, which advance violence as a public health issue. In the declaration, there was a support in terms of Mexico's litigation against America, or the gun manufacturer, not against America, but the gun manufacturers. The next step, if there is a next step, it would involve, I would say, heads of government of CARICOM taking that decision. However, we must also remember that there is much lobbying and negotiation occurring with the US currently with regard to reducing the illicit trade of weapons and much partnership. So all of that must be taken into consideration whilst you are lobbying, while you are partnering with someone, should you bring litigation against companies within that country. So you see the contradiction there also. So there are those factors to take into consideration. And we must admit that America has stepped up its support in terms of reducing the issue of illicit arms flows to the Caribbean. A lot of financial support is being done. A lot of capacity is being provided to the Caribbean countries. So all of this must be taken into consideration. So it's not just litigation on its own, but we must remember there are other factors which we must look at.
Well said. Thank you very much. We've got about 50 minutes before we're obliged to end. So let me request that we do the following. I'd love to have, beginning with Melissa, each of the panelists offer their final thoughts. But if in the context of those final thoughts, you can identify one or two priorities you would recommend for Caribbean governments or the United States to embrace in dealing with this issue of arms trafficking. Final thoughts, including your final thoughts, what would you have as one or two priority actions for the United States or for the Caribbean? We'll start with Melissa, then we'll go to Calixtus, and then Mr. Carpio, and then Mr. Sagaris. After that, we'll have our vote of thanks from Ms. Nalini Mahabir. Melissa?
Okay. Thank you for handing over. So final thoughts, I think that this is a prolific issue because we see how drastic the population, the general population, the panic of having gun violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And they just across the region, you see it's becoming more problematic. And the prevalence of these guns within our context is disturbing because of the high murder rates that we are seeing now. And so my final thoughts are, it is going to be a long and very tedious process to eliminate gun violence or even reduce gun violence or try to eliminate guns from within the vast population that attain guns, these illicit guns. And so firearms trafficking should be on the docket in terms of helping the crime situation. But we cannot negate the fact there are other factors, underlying factors, that has brought the use of guns and firearms to light. And so those factors are also very imperative in trying to eliminate this idea of use of firearms for violent crimes. And so when we look into the temperament of people, the reasons in which young persons are even getting involved with it, the use of firearms, the lack of value for life and human life, the resort to crime or criminal activity with the use of guns for income or economic reasons. All these underlying issues have to be tackled as well, in addition to the strategies to remove the guns from the population. So that's my take home. With regards, I hope I'm not mistaken what you're saying. But with regards to what we could do, I think that in general, information sharing, I think the region, the countries globally could come together, especially if this initiative is important in their country, in their geographical location, especially the United States and the Eastern Caribbean. They could merge information sharing, our intelligence, and I think that it's already forged. And so that we'll be able to have a lot more information about where the guns are coming, because as like Mr. Joseph said, that when they're actually leaving their country, they're less likely to care about the export and what is coming into another person's country. So maybe understanding what is being exported from countries, not only what is being imported, is important. And it's very clear that information sharing and networking and partnerships are necessary to to at least mitigate this problem within our country.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Calixtus, final thoughts, including any priorities you want to recommend?
Thank you, Chair. Every day, 13 persons are killed in this region, in the Caribbean. This is quite sobering. So gun violence is having a devastating impact on communities, on individuals. However, gun violence is not an insurmountable issue, and violence can be reduced significantly. This has been shown in many parts of the world, in many communities. But what could we do? There are three key issues I'd like to propose. One, we'll have to denormalize the issue of violence in this region. Second, we need to look at the issue of demand for illicit weapons. And thirdly, we need to pay greater attention to the issue of corruption. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Calixtus. Mr. Carpio and then Mr. Zagaris.
Regional cooperation, information sharing, just focusing on that illicit trafficking piece. There are efforts ongoing, just a lot that CARICOM Impacts has undertaken. And I mean, between the United States and the Caribbean, but also between Caribbean countries, just emphasizing that information sharing, that cooperation is just really critical. Thank you.
Okay. Over to you, Bruce.
So I would emphasize better strategy with interested stakeholders like the governments of Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, and non-governmental organizations. I would also look to do more in international organizations like the OAS. Here, Sir Ronald Sanders, for instance, led the Permanent Council of the OAS on November 1, 2023 on this issue, and the Permanent Council is still engaged. I would consider legislation to maybe sanction some of the gun manufacturers. I mean, other countries do this around the world. They have sanctions against persons who are creating crimes of violence, and CARICOM with other countries should consider doing this. And then finally, I would emphasize having some of the countries that are the biggest sources of illicit firearms trafficking to sign and implement, to ratify and implement the leading conventions on illicit trafficking in firearms, namely the UN Convention, known as the ATT, the OAS Convention, known as CIFTA, and the Firearms Protocol to the Palermo Convention. Unfortunately, the US and Canada, for instance, haven't ratified and implemented these conventions. And then finally, I also underscore information sharing. In that regard, I call attention to proposed legislation, the Caribbean Arms Trafficking Causing Harm Act, which is called the CATCH Act, whereby Congress would require the coordinator for the Caribbean firearms prosecutions in DOJ to file regular reports on intelligence about gun trafficking. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Before we do the final two tasks for this session, let me read you another part of the letter from the attorneys general of those states to the leaders of Congress. We therefore urge you to consider ways in which the United States government can do more to address this illicit flow, including by, 1, ensuring that inspectors at our ports are given sufficient resources to inspect shipments being sent from the United States to countries in the Caribbean. 2, ensuring that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives has sufficient funding to inspect federal firearms licenses. that are responsible for a disproportionate number of firearms that are traced after having been used in crimes in countries in the Caribbean. And 3, requesting briefings from the United States Postal Service, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice about their ongoing efforts to interdict shipments of guns from the United States to countries in the Caribbean, with a focus on what additional resources and legal tools they need to accomplish this important task. In other words, these attorneys general are asking not only for platitudes by Congress, but they're asking for action. I'll be following this issue, as I'm sure many of you in the program will be, to see whether there is action ultimately by Congress. Here are the 2 final things we need to do. I am delighted to thank everyone who is contributing to the success of this event by participating. I want to thank especially the organizers at the Institute of International Relations. I want to thank the panelists in particular for the breadth and depth of their contributions. And I want to invite one of our graduate students, Ms. Nalini Nahabir, to offer the vote of thanks. And immediately after the vote of thanks, I request that the panelists stay for a group photo. So over to you, Nalini.
Thank you, Professor Ivilo. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, panelists, colleagues, and friends. As we draw to the close of today's impactful and insightful webinar, it is my privilege to offer the closing remarks and vote of thanks on behalf of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. First, let us extend our heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished panelists who took their precious time today to be with us. Dr. Melissa Neptune Figaro, Mr. Calixtus Joseph, Mr. Ivan Carpio, and Mr. Bruce Zagarias. Your depth of knowledge, research, and real-world expertise have significantly enriched our understanding of illicit firearms and the wider challenges facing the Caribbean region. We are also grateful to our moderator, Professor Ivlo Lloyd Griffith, for steering today's webinar with such skill and clarity. A special thank you to you, Dr. Montut and Mr. Zagarias, for your opening remarks, and to all who have participated. To the audience, thank you very much for attending and participating throughout the webinar with your comments and questions. And last but not least, thank you all for your time and participation, and we look forward to continuing a collaboration like this in the future. So have a good evening.
Thank you, Nalini. And we'll turn it over to the technical folks for the group picture.